Hello friends and welcome back to Generation Pixel, and today, well, it's Thursday and I'm going to stick to my word and we'll have another episode of the A to Z X of the spectrum, and today's letter, well, it's the second one, it's B, so just hold on until after the titles. First up, I'm going to let you have a look at Batman, published by Ocean Software in 1986, and it was one of the most beloved genres of the time, and that is the isometric puzzle platform game. Now, looking at it with modern eyes, it doesn't look fantastic, but in 1986 we had 3D gaming, which was something that even the 8-bit consoles of the time were too afraid to try and grapple with. Now, don't get me wrong, it's far from perfect. The isometric view that gives the 3D effect is something that would cause you multiple hours of frustration just because you didn't line your character up pixel perfect to make that jump, and you would fall and die over and over again. But we are of course talking about a game from the 8-bit microcomputer era, so the fact that you had multiple different characters, enemies, sprites on the screen, which were quite large and fairly well defined for the time, was something quite special. And although the gameplay itself was fairly straightforward, with the main aim of the game to find all the parts of the Bat hovercraft, the fact that the isometric view and the pixel perfect jumps and timings that you had to make forced multiple errors, which gave the game the longevity that it needed to make it one of the most cherished games at the time. And on top of all that, there were 4 special items that you had to collect throughout each of the different mazes. The rocket pack, the shoes so you could jump, the utility belt. Packed so much diversity into what was such a simple game. And of course, on top of all that, the main selling point, it was Batman. And who doesn't like a good Batman game? Next up, we're going all the way back to 1983, so yes, this is almost a launch title for the 8-bit microcomputers, and that game is Beachhead, which was published by US Gold. Now yes, as you're looking up here, the first part of the gameplay is merely to move a cursor to another point on the screen. Not dramatically exciting, but you've got to remember these were the early days of video games. Once however you get your cursor into place, you then have a part that's more like traditional gameplay as you try to navigate your ships, your fleet of ships that is, through a series of caverns. Now yes, all the caverns look the same. The enemy torpedoes are nothing but lines and a spattering of dots just to indicate where the mines were that would blow up your ship if you did run into them. And like I said, all you had to do was get all your ships through the cavern in one piece to move on to the next part of the game. And yes, for the next part it's another cursor move to the next area, but of course it's an early game and what you're going to see now is different gameplay, which was something that they did quite a lot in the early days. And in this part of the gameplay, well, it was an elevation game. Quite simply, your gun turrets on your ship were what you were controlling, and you could change the elevation to shoot at the enemy planes that were trying to bomb your fleet of ships again. And once you had successfully survived the wave of enemy aircraft, you would then move on to trying to take out the enemy ships themselves. This of course took a lot of time and patience, as you would have to manually write down each elevation that didn't work until you finally got one that did, and then work your way through not just the one ship, but every ship on that screen. But of course, once you did manage to take out all the enemy ships, you were then able to move on to the next stage of the game. In this penultimate stage of the game, they mixed up the gameplay again. This time you were controlling the tanks that had rolled off the fleet of ships, and now you were making your way across the beach. A beach littered with obstacles and landmines and occasionally even enemy turrets for you to shoot. Now as you can see, it's a simple side scroller, but if you look closely the frame rate is not great, and that's basically because there was no true scrolling back in the 8-bit days, certainly not back in 1983 when this game was released. But of course you would trundle your tank along, and at the end you would face the final challenge, the last part of the game, and you would take on the boss. The boss itself being a monstrous citadel, and the game reverts back once more to an elevation game where you have several targets on the citadel that you have to take out with well aimed shots before the huge turret gun on top of the citadel turns, fires and wipes out your army. Now granted, it's nothing special by today's standards, but in 1983 the mixture of gameplay and the excitement you felt when you finally worked out the correct elevations on the gun missions, or even the simple pleasure of moving on to another stage of the game, was something that kept you playing this game over and over again until you managed to finally defeat that enemy citadel. And of course it wasn't just original games that were developed for the ZX Spectrum or the rest of the 8-bit computer market. No, we also had our fair share of arcade ports. And one of the most beloved of these ports, well, it's Bomb Jack. Originally released into arcades by Taycan in 1984, who would then become Tecmo, the 8-bit home microports hit the market in 1986. Despite being such an early and simple arcade game, the ports didn't end with the 8-bit microcomputers. Bomb Jack was ported all the way up to 2003 for Java ME, which is all down to its simple yet addictive gameplay. Another classic B title that would stand the test of time is of course Boulder Dash. Released originally in 1984 by First Star Software for Atari 8-bit computers, the simple but addictive 2D maze puzzler would simply grab the attention of gamers all over the world and of all different age groups. Like Bomb Jack previously, Boulder Dash would be ported long after its original release, and would even see releases on the Wii. And of course, like Bomb Jack and many games of this ilk, they spawned many sequels. And perhaps because of the limitations of technology at the time, the developers of games back in the 80s really had to find the essence of game. And for me, that's probably why they've stood the test of time, and there will always be a place for games like Boulder Dash. Now, if there was one genre of game that I would absolutely adore, especially back in the day, it was puzzle platformers. And this particular B game, Booty, was one of my all-time favourites. It was one of Firebird Software's earliest releases in 1984, and would leave such a mark on me, any Firebird release from then on in easily grabbed my attention. Now there were plenty of platformers on the ZX Spectrum and the other 8-bit microcomputers, but what I loved the most about Booty was the fact that you didn't have to jump. Don't get me wrong, there's nothing wrong with pixel perfect jumping action platformers, but for me, I truly loved the puzzle platform aspect of these games. It wasn't about the action so much as how much thought you put into the route you were going to take with your character. And this fascination with slow, determined gameplay was probably the roots of what was going to lead to my love of RPGs. Now don't get me wrong, just because you have to be thoughtful and work out your routes with Booty didn't mean that there was no action elements to it. No, as you progressed through the levels, there were various puzzles to solve. From seemingly impossible items to collect, to floating platforms that you would have to time almost pixel perfect, just to progress to the next room and hopefully collect that much lust after booty. So there you have it folks, 5 games from the ZX Spectrum from the letter B, the second in the series. I know, I'm as surprised as you. Anyway, if you've enjoyed this video, please give us a thumbs up, it makes a great deal of difference to the channel. And if you want to see more, subscribe, but more importantly, please comment. Did you play any of these games back in the day? Have any of these games piqued your interest to go back and play some 8-bit micros? Well, let me know in the comments. And Thank you again for watching, and until next time, cheerio!